Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 39 of IGEL Weekly. It's been a few weeks. We've had a couple holidays kick in, and Chris and I are back today. We're going to be doing a corporate blog today. Chris, how was the holidays?
It was great. I used given where Christmas fell, I used that to give myself some extra time, about almost 2 weeks, to just kind of decompress, let the end of the year kind of float away, and then just started focusing on re-engaging for 2022. So didn't have to travel too much, thankfully. So that was good. But yeah, enjoyed some good downtime. And honestly, I had a lot of stuff little side projects at home I needed to get taken care of, or at least start on, and I've made some progress there. So it feels good.
So this was one of those years where most of the holidays fell on a weekend. Therefore, the extra day off fell on the day before the weekend or the
Right.
day after the weekend, or both. And for someone like me, I'm to a point where I like to work. At the same time, it's overwhelming, the amount of stuff going on. So I felt myself being pulled between needing to work to get caught up, also needing to take family vacation time. I guess when it's such a big gap and you throw in a PTO in the middle of it, it's just a really long time off, and it's almost scary what you're going to come back to.
Yeah. Yeah, thankfully the inbox wasn't completely overwhelmed. I think a lot of people, being the end of the year, thankfully it seemed to calm down. But there were a few things that I had to jump on yesterday, which I don't know about you. We had some crazy weather yesterday. It started off with monsoon, and then snow in the middle of the day. Then it was sunny and blue skies. That's crazy.
That's kind of like the old wives' tale, especially here in this part of the South. Well, the whole South, really, where other than Florida, where it starts off warm, ends up snowing by the end of the day, and then may totally change again by the time nightfall comes.
Yeah, because we had almost 3 weeks of 60, 70-degree weather.
Yeah.
So we were definitely long overdue for a winter snap. So, but
it's funny. I had these long-term plans to live part-time in a warmer climate during the winter. And, I go from, I was in Puerto Rico last week, so I was experiencing that, and then this week it all gets cold again, or gets cold. It's cold. It's winter. I don't know. I'm like Jekyll and Hyde. I okay, I want it to be cold. Okay, now I want to be warm. Now I want to be cold.
Yeah.
I want to be warm. Now I want to be warm. Now I want to be cold. It doesn't matter.
I thought, having been to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, if I had to pick, I would just say probably Virgin Islands. St. Croix.
To live or to vacation
though? Vacation. I mean, I've been to I haven't been to everywhere in Puerto Rico. Been to certain places. Been to a rewards trip there on the northern coast, not too far from San Juan. But we had such a great time in St. Croix. I haven't been to St. John or that other island, which I have a dive map sitting here to my left that I should probably pull up and study. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, our family still remembers that vacation. It was like 7-8 years ago when the kids were in middle school or whatever. So, yeah. But
yeah, so one quick comment out. Every time I'm there, I make a wrong turn off the interstate, and I end up at the office where the Citrix office and the Microsoft office and all the technology companies are in one little place. I think the area it's called City View, and I'm like, oh, you could live and work here and work for these companies, and then reality sets in, and you're like, oh well, maybe not. But there's certainly, Citrix really had a bunch of employees out there at one point. I think they moved them to Florida at this point, but at one point Puerto Rico was where a lot of their managed services came from.
Interesting. Yeah, hopefully they've recovered some from those hurricanes that went through that area a couple of years ago.
Hurricane Maria, and a lot of it's recovered. Still remnants of it, but it's certainly come a long way. And I went twice this year, once in April and then once in December, and you could tell that there was improvements between the two. Just, who knows what's coming next year.
Yeah, no doubt.
Well, Chris, you and I were talking before about a lot of stuff, but one of the things we were talking about is what corporate blog to cover today. And we decided to do one on ARM versus IGEL OS on ARM and the use cases. And I think this has really become a topic over the last year or so as the Raspberry Pi based NComputing RX420 became a real thing in the world of IGEL OS. So let me pull that blog up. But to give our listeners insight into that, it's basically the ability to take IGEL prepackaged on a ARM-based device and use it for certain use cases. And what we find is a lot of people are so excited about ARM versus x86 and IGEL, a lightweight Linux operating system, that they think they can solve a lot of problems with it. And maybe someday, and you can talk about this to some degree, they will be able to, but for now, it's not the end all be all for every use case. So can you kind of just set us up in here what the intro into the article? So the blog is from December 7th, IGEL OS on ARM, use cases to consider. And can you kind of set us up with the intro here and what they're covering?
Yeah, so really the sort of the outset is, this is now just about a year into the launch of this solution with the RPI4 from NComputing. And the big question is, why ARM? We've always had this x86, 64-bit focus. Why ARM? And the reality is, right up top, the ARM platform is not going away. There's multiple use cases that we'll cover here in a minute. And it's always good to have other alternative options, but there are significant differences between the two platforms. And really it's just, educating. It's like, what is the right solution? And also begs the question, well, there's other ARM devices out there from NComputing. Can I repurpose those? And the answer here for us is no. We have a very specific one from NComputing, actually two models. One has more RAM than the other, but two different solutions that I think would do very well. And then, as the future unfolds, maybe more options will become available, maybe additional focus. Right now it's Citrix in a browser, but maybe more to come as we move forward into the coming year. So
let me bring up a couple of things here. One, you mentioned others using ARM. I think the one that caught me off guard was probably 6 months or so ago. I went to buy my kids new computers for college. My daughter wanted a Mac. I go to talk to the guy about buying a Mac, and he starts talking about the new platform versus the old platform. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he starts talking about ARM-based Mac devices, Apple devices for big high-end 17-inch screen monitor, laptops. And I was like, oh my gosh, I mean, does that mean ARM has come that far in terms of being a platform of choice for, high-end computing? And I have to assume if Apple's using it for their MacBook Pros, then the power must be there.
yeah, I mean, certainly, what is the law of something that, just continuous technology?
Moore's law?
Change. Yeah, Moore's law. It's just continuous change. I mean, I think about back to holiday break, I spent some time reading a book, and then part of the book was bringing me back to things 20, 25 years ago, and how much has changed just in that short amount of time, to the point where to talk about like the early years of marriage, we didn't have cell phone. We didn't have a cell phone, and our kids be like, cell phone, no cell phone, like. It's crazy just all the technology change that has occurred. And so there'll be continuous move towards that. And obviously improvements so that it can handle some of those heavier use cases. And also things become lighter and more mobile. So I've not actually checked out the Apple one, but
well, knowing Apple the way we both do you think Apple's doing it because it's a better platform, or because it gets them away from a behemoth of a company like Intel, and they can now, own the platform more closely than they could have if they stay on top of Intel's compute workloads?
I think if you look at, like, I just recently got my daughter for her birthday an Apple Watch. We didn't get the highest end. We got the middle one, the SE one, or whatever the model is, but it has most of the features, but it doesn't have everything under the sun. I think it's Apple moving, and expanding their product base, giving more choice, which means they have to sometimes, look at without trying to sacrifice the user experience. And that's the one thing about IGEL that really, Apple, sorry, I work for IGEL, but we're talking about Apple, is their user experience, setting something up, making it very simple, but giving additional choice there. And, if at some point ARM gets to a point where it can completely, be on par with Intel, I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think it's just expanding choice and and also expanding the market, right? If only a certain segment of the market can afford Apple products, but they see a need in other areas, why not go down that route? So,
well, and I think what you bring up is it could be technology, it could be business, it could be options, it could be customer demand. But to the point of this blog, it's here to stay. It's kind of like the old days of AMD versus Intel. Now it's ARM versus x86. And there's enough compelling reasons why it is a player in this space.
yeah.
Will be, and something we need to talk about more and more, like we're doing here. I do have another question for you. You mentioned 2 models now for the RX420. The assumption is for me that it's the bottleneck in an ARM versus x86 world is performance at the processor level. But you mentioned a device with more memory. Can you kind of explain why IGEL needed to work with NComputing to throw some more memory in, at least another option?
Well, I think when we initially launched the solution, it was just the RX420, if I recall. I found out later that there is this additional model, the 440, which had, I think, a little bit more RAM. And I don't have the specs up at the moment, but I think it was something between 4 gigs of RAM versus 8 gigs or something. And the processing is probably a little bit similar, but certainly will stand corrected on that. But it really came down to, as you get, more RAM into that thing, it can handle more use cases or more workload. And so you have 2 different models there, which, it really coming down to, as we were talking earlier, going in, talking to your customers, seeing what problems they have, and seeing, ultimately what solution may help solve that problem. I think one of the bigger things I've seen, certainly with the RX420 and the ARM platform, is the offloading of unified comms, and can it handle that as well as an x86 platform, 64-bit type thing, and so if it can't or can only go to a certain point, then maybe the RX440 can do a better job, or it's just you actually need a different platform. But knowing what are some key use cases here, which we'll get into, is really it's really just educating, understanding that, and then here's your options. So that's basically what I did when we looked at the Apple Watch for my daughter. Like, you had the Apple Watch 7, you had the Apple Watch 6, you had the Apple Watch SE, I think is what it's called. And then you kind of look at the comparisons between the two. And did my daughter need an EKG thing? No. I mean, GPS, yeah. It's more plastic versus, or it's aluminum casing versus whatever it is. Anyways, so we decided on what we decided on, and she gets what's today?
As I was coming up as a young desktop administrator, server administrator, my Unix counterpart in the shop that I worked in, he said to me one time, more memory is always better. And I think he's right. At the same time, he also pointed out that it's a business conversation. Are you buying the memory just for the sake of having more and you don't really need it? If you are, then that's a bad business decision. And that kind of comes back to this blog. It's, you can't just look at the power and performance. You got to look at the use case. And a lot of times IT guys like us, right? We just buy the biggest and best we can afford because that's what we do versus trying to right size it.
Yeah. And one thing we haven't really talked about is price point. If you are, IGEL, obviously we talk a lot about repurposing devices. This is not a repurposing. This is a brand new device running IGEL. So if you are looking out to replace devices and you're going to buy new hardware, what is the price point, and then what are the use cases that this would solve?
Yeah.
I know you've had I don't know how often, but I mean, I have one of these devices. I think it's the 420, not the 440, but in setting it up, I mean, honestly, it's a really nice platform. And for the use cases that I've tested with, it does a really nice job.
Yeah.
But for my regular day-to-day stuff, I need my UD7, which is a more powerful thin client for the things that I do on a daily basis. But
Well, so for our listeners, let's just,
yeah,
RX 420 is roughly $200 list price. Does that sound close?
yeah. And so looking here, I just pulled up, just did a quick search, and I think the in computing is where you would get pricing from, or through one of their disties. But for the 440, the little higher model, I think a list price about 225, something
Yeah.
like that. So that's not terrible at all.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't include, let's see, I don't think that includes the IGEL licensing, but
No, it
for
does. I think it does.
well, yeah, in the yeah, so say all encompassing there, whatever it might be. So you're
So,
not
so 420 about $200, a 440 about 225, and you can get those from people like XenTegra, right? That's where everybody
correct.
should buy it from.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then ballpark for me, and look, IGEL is a software company that can go on almost any x86. When you talk about ARM, you have to buy it through the NComputing RX 420 or 440. So that's when it becomes tied to the hardware. But you can also tie it to IGEL hardware if you want. And in your case, a UD7. And those things probably, list price around $700. Is that about right?
Yeah, there's different models. So mine has the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, smart card, and it doesn't have the fiber port that I recall. But various models, might have a little bit of price difference.
Yeah. But here's the short answer, right?
Yeah,
Between that UD7 and that RX 420, somewhere in the mix is the right combination of IGEL software on IGEL issued hardware for everybody who's trying to work in an EUC digital workspace cloud computing world. And if you don't like that particular brand of hardware, you don't like that particular hardware, then go take the IGEL OS and put it on whatever x86 hardware you want, or you already have maybe.
yeah. And the thing we've done with this when we don't launch is the licensing. If you did have a machine running with an IGEL OS 11 license, you could move that license over to the NComputing platform,
Right.
or move it to another platform, so you're not stuck on a particular platform as far as the license goes.
So let's jump in this blog. I should give Simon Clephan credit for the blog. He's the one that wrote it. We're just reviewing it. So we're going to go into, I think, 4 use cases here. All of these use cases apply to everything IGEL runs on, but these use cases for the RX 420 and 440s are just great examples of where you might get away with using this lower end ARM-based solution, still solve the problem, solve it well, and at a lowest possible price point. So the first one is potentially a super easy one. Let's don't take it too trivial though. And that is digital signage, which, based on size and capabilities and what the end user is doing with it, probably sounds like a no-brainer.
Yeah, and if you think about it, where you've walked somewhere could be, shopping, it could be in the airport, it could be hotels, wherever. If there's signage up, sometimes you might notice it, but chances are it might catch your eye if you happen to see something that probably shouldn't be up, like a blue screen of death or something else. If it's running Windows, and you're doing digital signage with it, what happens when that is compromised and now some other message gets popped up, for that particular business or whatever. So if that's your use case, a digital signage with this device would be completely, the resolution on it is pretty darn good. But you could easily run slideshows. You could do, just standard messaging. It's a very simple use case and does really, and also the form factor, you could have that thing,
So Chris, I'll give you a great example,
yeah.
not necessarily signage, but more the kiosk number 4 here. I stay at Marriott's, right? They're part of the Bonvoy. They're the Bonvoy system now. For probably 6 months now, I've been walking into Marriott's and the hotel kiosk machines are sitting there. They weren't compromised by malware. They were compromised by, I'll call it Microsoft in this case, where it's sitting there on the screen where it pops up and says, okay, what security preferences do you want? and you walk up and you answer all the questions, hit okay, and then it reboots the machine and goes right back to it. And I literally have walked in the same hotel for weeks in a row, and it's still sitting there. Nobody fixed it. Like, it was compromised by the hotel management / Microsoft by just pushing out updates that then required new answers to those questions. It wasn't malware. It was just normal day-to-day operation that's now made these kiosks, or what could have been digital signage machines, just out of use for weeks and weeks and weeks. And nobody at the hotel even notices.
Or can do anything about it because it's not controlled locally. Right. And yet you as a, I mean, I've been using Marriott for years now. So when you walk up, you have an experience you'd like, and you may have already checked in. You're just there to grab your key or whatever it is. And if you can't do that, I mean, think about the airport. When you walk at the airport, I mean, if you need to check a bag or whatever, you got that self-serve option that is touchscreen enabled, whatever. I mean, just real easy. If that goes down and it's a busy travel day, I mean, these are all things that can impact that user experience at the end of the day. So yeah, another great use case there for having something that when it boots up, it's pretty reliable and very, the footprint for being attacked or compromised or whatever is very low. So
I think a lot of that comes from a world where it's built for the work environment, not for the consumer environment, where they, consumer environment, they just assume some user is going to sit there, answer those questions and move on. We're trying to use these things for a non-persistent world that's centralized management, and the person who manages it will never ever see that actual device.
Yeah.
Okay. So next one is industrial controls.
Yeah. It's just the devices that need to be managed by some unit, and doesn't require a ton of horsepower to necessarily do it, or even add some code. So there's apart from having a browser and some Citrix functionality, there's other things that are available to just the native IGEL OS running on this device that you could leverage here. It is Visa mountable, so it could be put inside of a protective unit or on the back of something, if all it's needed, just maintain and keep those things moving or whatever, that's another great use case. And I'm sure there's even more just in that particular realm.
Well, let's take this one back to the first one. I mean, they're both, it's Visa mountable. It's somewhat, trashable, right? You can throw it away if you really want to. You shouldn't, but you could throw it away because it's just not that expensive. There's really nothing on it. It's not going to fill up that much space in the landfill. I'm not condoning that. That's not what you do. In fact, I've got lots of investments of my own to try to fix that problem. But so Chris, for the first two, why wouldn't I just buy an all-in-one computer and throw it up on the back of a industrial shelf or up on a side of the wall in the airport?
Well, you certainly could. It's really just comes down to several things that we talked about earlier. What's your price point? What's your cost? I mean, reliability. If so many different ways we could answer that, but because obviously you will be buying a device. So if money is no object, then look at all your options. If you have a need where maybe you might need the power of an x86 down the road for a different use case or additional use cases, and the RX420 or 440 won't meet that initially or later on, then yeah, but still for some of these use cases, I mean, it's going to be right on target.
Well, Chris, imagine a world where I bought that all-in-one, threw it up on the wall in the airport, and all of a sudden it breaks. I got to unmount the whole thing, put a new one up there, versus just swapping out the little, what I call potato chip on the back of it.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's definitely, I mean, the all-in-one, certainly there's pros and cons to it. It's a good point.
Yeah. And we haven't really talked about this. It doesn't have a lot of moving parts for number one and number two. Really for all four of these use cases, the chances of it actually physically breaking are almost zero.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because maybe right before Christmas, I actually was doing some updates on one of my devices here, and I have it plugged into a TV where after like I don't know, 30 minutes it goes dark, and I completely forgot about it for 2 days. And I came back upstairs one day, I was like, oh, that thing's still running, totally silent, and it just, I turned the TV back on and it was right where I left off. I was like, so they can just keep running and they don't consume much power, not a lot of heat. There's a ton of options there, especially for some of these, simple use cases.
Yeah.
So,
Well, let's hit number 3 here, and that is the title of this section is Citrix powered shared workspace. As you mentioned a while ago, the RX420, which is a joint effort between IGEL and NComputing, that one is specifically for Citrix workloads. Well, not necessarily because it has a browser on it, so there's lots of other things you can do. But when it comes to the end user compute platforms that are out there, Citrix is the one. The RX420 is dedicated to working with that IGEL and NComputing help co-produce. I will say for the group before you jump into this that there are things that it can't do that IGEL installed on x86 random hardware or IGEL hardware can do. But for the most part, when it comes to Citrix related stuff, it can do almost everything you need it to do. You want to jump into the Citrix use case beyond what I said?
Yeah, no, you kind of, that was really one of the main focus areas was Citrix being our largest VDI vendor type partner. And knowing why we didn't initially jump on older versions of the Raspberry Pi, coming to market with this one was to try to address Citrix shops where they needed a device that was reliable and could more or less cover a multitude of use cases. One that is highlighted here is the Citrix Hub, the casting capability, which is kind of cool. I don't know how many customers are using it, but to have this in a conference room, that's a scenario where you just walk in and you can, QR code your session into the IGEL device sitting there. It's actually pretty cool to see that take place. Last year, I worked on a demo with Citrix in a healthcare scenario where he started badge tapped in, got his workspace up and running, and then he brought it to his iPad, walked into a patient room, and then cast it up onto the screen, and then was able to go over the chart or whatever with and that's just one scenario. There's a multitude of that, but so it's a pretty, when it comes to Citrix, I mean, it's definitely very functional, and we've got for guys like unified comms or webcam redirector, there's a great guide that I've put up there on how to use that with the Raspberry Pi RX420 here, 440. And
I run into people all the time that take that, like we said earlier, and they want to just use it to solve everything. And but you guys have done a good job of making it very capable, but it really needs to fit the use case. And I did want to highlight something you said there. You said this is version number 4 of the Raspberry Pi. A lot of people jumped on earlier. I jumped on version 1 with what Citrix was doing with the Citrix Workspace Hub. And it was horrible, not because of the software that was on it, not what Citrix was doing, but the compute of the device. It would just die on me every so often, and I'd have to unplug it and let it. It just wasn't ready for mainstream EUC endpoint workloads at that time.
Yeah, and when talking with Simon, who wrote the blog, that's one of the first things sort of he addresses, is why now is we did IGEL probably before I even arrived here 3+ years ago, had looked at, going down the route of an RX420 ARM platform, but determined it just wasn't ready for the enterprise. And now that this version 4 is out, we decided we would go to market with it. And obviously starting with some key use cases and expanding from there. And so, yeah, I mean, one thing that's not on here, at least I don't see it, is sort of a work from home, which would probably be a use case 3 scenario. Having a nice device, purpose built for Citrix and IGEL workloads.
So Chris, why would I own my own company, right? I have the option of sending people stuff, and I don't send them RX420s to work remote during the pandemic and before and afterwards. But I do it intentionally because I don't think it's that good as a work from home. Why would you, and I'm not saying you're wrong, I just want to hear your logic on why you would even bring that one into the mix.
I think part of it depends on the use case from working from home. What do you need it for? If it's, let's take somebody that is like yesterday, I called support for our Concur solution. I have no idea where that person took the call. I also called American Express Global Services because there was a couple things on my, and presumably they're working from home. I don't know that, but perhaps. And it's just a call center scenario. And if all they're doing is taking calls and looking up stuff on a virtual desktop or some platform or whatever, they're not having multiple like 20-person Zoom calls or whatever. That might be an ideal scenario in that situation. Plus the device, if it's not that expensive, if something does happen or the person leaves the company, they may not return the device. You're not out a ton of money. So
well, you hit on two that I want to talk about. Number one, the idea that they take a call. So in that case, are they taking a call on a handset, or are they taking it through some VoIP technology using the Raspberry Pi as the device?
they could either one. It might be some functionality that's delivered where you're redirecting the headset or whatever into the Citrix session, or maybe it's just through the native browser and there's some kind of plug-in there and just leveraging whatever's plugged in. And you don't need a ton of power to be able to handle that call.
Yeah.
So,
and then you hit on the second one, which I think is the one that's super compelling and why I consider doing it every so often. And that is the ability to have a low cost device that, you have them use their old monitor, their old keyboard, or the bottom monitor keyboard that they could use later if they needed to, if it didn't work out. And the device itself, they could just send back, or again, I'll use these words, throw it away. But you're not out a whole lot of money if that's what happens to it.
Yeah. In fact, I actually, now that we're talking about it, I have a spare monitor. I might try to plug this in and just set one up downstairs just to have it as a, in case I need to pull up a browser real quickly or something.
Yeah.
Well,
I highlight on the screen here, there's this one element of this that we haven't really talked about, and that's the Citrix casting capabilities for that Workspace hub type scenario where you're walking in and you've got your Citrix session running on your iPad or even your phone, and you're using the RX420 and you cast it up to it. That's part of the Citrix Workspace hub technology. Have you seen much of that happening?
I have not, other than that initial demo that I mentioned earlier. I've not seen it, but honestly, I mean, the user experience is pretty easy. You just set it up. There's a code sitting there. You just walk up and you scan it, and it just takes your session and immediately throws it up. It's very similar to if you're using your iPhone and you can share your screen and cast it. Kind of, I mean, it's the same concept, but it's a very simple step. And if that's the scenario, I mean, you've seen some of these conference rooms, they have like sort of WebEx conference room meeting or whatever, a similar scenario, but just leveraging this Citrix hub functionality.
Yeah, it's definitely a Nirvana type of scenario. I've seen it demoed. I just haven't really seen it in production. I have one client that was trying to do it a couple of years ago, and for whatever reason they stopped. I think they just ran out of time testing it. It didn't work. They just had other initiatives they had to take care of.
Yeah. I mean, if there are reasons why it wouldn't work, I'm not necessarily aware of those right now. But from what I've initially seen, again, it would seem like a fairly easy use case. If you're just using it to bring up your PowerPoint in the meeting or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's a nice little tool to have that just walk in and just use that Citrix hub
Well, there's another
functionality.
element of this thing that isn't talked about here, where you have this proximity-based identification system, where you have your phones in your pocket, and your phone connects to this thing, and it realizes, oh, Chris is now in the room. Let's send him a little code. If he hits yes, let's cast his screen up onto this. There's a lot of that follow me session type of stuff that can be enabled through low-cost devices like this that hopefully we'll see more and more evolution of.
Yeah, certainly that location-based awareness you get a chance to see some of this at some of these demo and shows that we haven't been able to go to necessarily, but it is cool to be able to see how they're taking this technology, either that exists and they're just leveraging it for different use cases, or it's something new that's coming.
Yeah.
But it is cool when you see all that and you're like, that's I feel like all of a sudden you stepped into an episode of Star Trek or something.
Yeah. Well, you stepped into things that we as technologists, dreamed about 20 years ago, and now it's potentially reality.
Yeah.
How it evolves. All right. The last use case, kiosk, which if you're the technology nerd like we are, That's because you just can't wait to set up a kiosk in your kitchen downstairs. Um, that has been something, I'm sure you've done it. I've done it. I had kiosk systems all over my house at one point. Now people just walk around with tablets, or their computer in their pocket, aka their phone. But certainly kiosks, low end use cases powered by the RX420 or 440 makes a lot of sense versus throwing a big physical piece of equipment, costly physical piece of equipment, or ugly even if you're reusing something from a decade ago. Let's talk about the kiosk scenario from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, so many different scenarios. I mean, if you take, libraries, right, where, um, uh, the first sentence there talks about a secure, unhackable appliance that you can get easy access to the internet. Obviously, going to the internet, you run the risk of something. But when you're running it from an IGEL device that is purpose built for handling a secure, scenario, trying to get to the internet, you don't want to be able to get exposed to malware and other things. And that's the same IGEL OS that's running on an x86 is running on the ARM platform here. And again, as I mentioned, public library, college library, high school libraries, whatever, you want to be able to control, through various means where they can go and what they can't go to, for example, but at the same time, allow it not to be exposed or compromised. And if need be, just reboot the machine or whatever, and you're back to where things started, or they close the browser. Similar to when you're trying to print that boarding pass, you go through, you check your email, whatever, and then you get that pass, and then print it out. You don't want anything left on that device.
Right.
Be able to control that whole experience would be a great scenario for something like a kiosk. And we've got Chromium built in. Chromium is obviously widely used and is a platform for what Chrome is built on, essentially.
Yeah.
Edge and everything. So
Well, let's highlight on that a little bit. So we talked a while ago about interacting with Citrix sessions, which is very applicable for what IGEL customers do. However, you see more and more customers that just need a browser to get to those SaaS-based applications.
mhm.
And when IGEL started including in the operating system, no matter what the hardware is, repurposed, IGEL x86 or the ARM platform, which we're talking about here today, having that browser in there just opens up so many use cases, and having specifically something based on a Chromium enables a lot of those sites, almost all of them, I'll say, to become a supported platform to interact with.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen you post on LinkedIn or whatever before, where all you needed was a browser to get to that Citrix session.
Yeah.
So having access to that, especially on a supported browser, not some funky browser that's built for some kiosk, vendor that has some weird, not necessarily know what kind of browser it is or even how secure it is. But things you can certainly trust with IGEL. There's inside the box, when you look at the Chromium settings, there's certainly some settings that are on by default or additional ones you can control. But by and large, it's built to handle an insecure environment like the internet, in a read-only operating system that will be very difficult to compromise. So
I think you bring up a key item without actually saying it. It's a very controllable zero trust, both physically and from a virtual perspective, software wise. It's a zero trust platform.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, seriously, I mean, how many times have I walked up and be like, the only way I'm going to get this thing printed out is I got to log in and check my email, and I'm on a hotel public. I don't know if I trust doing that, and but I need to print, right? And there's a printer sitting right in there, and it's attached to this device, and so these are all things that we live in the world, and so but having a device like this that can be trusted, um, it is pretty good. So and there's probably more use cases, but these are some key ones. Certainly, when I say key, I wonder if we're trying to play on the word kiosk there, but certainly, if you have additional use cases when we post this podcast up, certainly loved your comments on LinkedIn or other social media to get your ideas on what's worked well.
Well, I think I just want to highlight here, IGEL, again, software-based Linux operating system that is built for the enterprise, built for company needs, extremely manageable, usable across lots of different technologies, including now the ARM-based platform. These are just some of the use cases, but if your use case extends beyond what the ARM platform can do, there's almost limitless opportunities to use the IGEL OS outside of this particular piece of hardware.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of it, is one pane of glass, if you will. We talk about that a lot. Same operating system across multiple devices, different use cases. And probably even some, if you've walked around seeing how is technology used inside this company, inside this business.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about, like I said, the digital signage. I mean, so many things that you could probably paint out here. I've not done too much on the industrial control thing. I'd certainly love to walk around and see how technology is used in those scenarios, but yeah, some great ones. We could probably think of a few others that aren't on this list, but Simon's done a really good job of sort of summarizing, some great opportunities here to use this NComputing platform with IGEL.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I would like to keep talking to you about this, but I'm out of time. In fact, I'm 10 minutes past the meeting that I was supposed to go run, but I appreciate you jumping on and going through this, and welcome to 2022. I look forward to more podcasts, more blog reviews, and working with IGEL and watching you guys take the Linux platform to where it needs to be, while the others, try to chase you a little bit.
Yeah. Well, thanks, man. I look forward to seeing you guys in person next week at your kickoff.
Yep. All right, sir. Thank you.
All right, take care.